Hey everybody, this is Jared Marlowe with the Blue and Gray Education Society here, and we have a great talk lined up for you today for our Rev War 101 series. Today we have with us a good friend of mine and a great historian, great author, um, homesteader, former attorney, and he can tell you more about that, and he can add to that list. But today we have with us Bill Guerrant. How's life, Bill?
Everything's great, Jared. Great to be here.
Yeah. Like I said, I've known Bill for years now, and I actually met him one day randomly at a bookstore where I was purchasing the book that he's going to talk mostly about, and that is "Let a Pillar Arise." And we'll talk more about that here in just a second. But one thing I do want to mention about Bill is Bill runs two very successful Facebook groups, and that is a Daily Dose of History, which I think you said has over 300,000 followers now. Is that right? As
That's
of
right.
as of March 2024. And then he also does a daily dose of the American Revolution, which I find truly fascinating because it's very specific. That's to kind of what we're going to talk about today. And it's very American Revolution centered, which he does a great job with both of those, laying out the history and always has a great corresponding image with it. So, Bill, did I miss anything in your introduction there that you wanted to
Oh,
add?
man, I appreciate that. It's great. Thanks.
Yeah, so be sure to go follow A Daily Dose of History and A Daily Dose of the American Revolution on Facebook if you haven't already. But without further ado, we will dive into today's topic, and that is General Greene and the race to the Dan and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And I know that Bill and I are kind of partial to this topic, given where we live in Southside Virginia. But the last time I heard Bill speak, he said something that is very true, and that is this is a story that needs to be heard by everybody because it sets up the rest of the war. And it just happened to happen where we live. But I'm going to let Bill talk about that. So, Bill, take it away. The floor is yours, and we look forward to it.
Great. All right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, Jared, and I love all the great work you're doing at Blue and Gray Education Society. So, thumbs up for that. So, what I want to talk about is the year 1781, specifically what I call the greatest turnaround year in American history. So, let me start with this. October the 19th, 1781, the British Army, commanded by Charles Lord Cornwallis, marches out of Yorktown onto what we now call Surrender Field and lays down their flags and arms, surrendering en masse to the American Army, Franco-American Army, commanded by George Washington. Now, that victory, one of the greatest victories in American history, arguably the greatest victory in American history, it did not end the Revolutionary War, but for all intents and purposes, it secured American independence. After that crushing defeat and the loss of so many men, the British government and the British people simply had no spirit to continue the fight. In essence, what happened at Yorktown ended the American Revolution for all intents and purposes, and we secured our independence. Now, if I had told you, if we had been talking in January of 1781, that same year, 10 months before the surrender at Yorktown, and I had said to you, folks, within the year, the British Army under Lord Cornwallis is going to surrender entirely, and we will have secured our independence, well, you would have rightfully thought that I was out of my ever-loving mind, because there was absolutely no reason in January of 1781 to think that American independence was going to be secured. These were some of the darkest, bleakest days of the Revolution. In fact, at that time, there was every reason to think our cause was going to fail. So let me set the stage for you. Let's review. Now, and pardon me if I'm giving you, I know you're all military history buffs, I'm going to do some basic stuff, but to remember the origin of this. The Revolutionary War began in April of 1775 at Lexington and Concord. This long, simmering series of disputes finally erupts in gunfire, the shot heard around the world, and the war is on. Okay. By January of 1776, the Continental Congress came to the conclusion that we are not going to work things out with the mother country. There isn't going to be any resolution of this. And they lay down, essentially throw down the gauntlet and issue the Declaration of Independence. Now, that beautiful document, that's a foundational document that we all love, that contains language that we revere. But you know what? That's just a historical footnote if you don't sustain it on the battlefield. Declaring your independence is one thing, Going out and winning it is quite another. And these revolutionaries undertook a pretty daunting task. This is a edge of the world, sparsely populated colonies, mostly agricultural, farmers, shopkeepers, no army, no navy. We're going to take on the British government, the most powerful government, powerful military on the planet. A pretty audacious undertaking. But that's what they did. Now, I'm not going to review the ups and downs, mostly downs, of the next 5.5 years. But suffice it to say, when January 1781 rolls around, the war's been going on almost 6 years, and we are no closer to winning that independence than we were when the war began. In fact, the situation there in January of 1781 is extraordinarily bleak. So let's review military situation at the beginning of the year. General Washington's army is camped outside of New York City. The British are fat and happy in New York. They're well provisioned, they're well supplied, they got their fleet there. They're riding out the winter inside New York. Washington's army is scattered in little posts around the city. In fact, Washington has so few provisions for his men that he can't even concentrate in one camp. In some respects, many respects, that winter of 1781 was harsher, worse than Valley Forge. Washington's army in this is a fact that I think is little known and little appreciated. In 1778, the main American army, Washington's main American army, had about average of about 24,000 men. By 1780, it was down to 14,000 men. By the beginning of 1781, the principal American army, commanded by George Washington, that's outside of New York, had about 6,000 men in it. It was about a quarter of the size it had been 3 years earlier. The army was so small and so poorly provisioned that Alexander Hamilton warned Washington, don't let the French see them. It may discourage them, it may cause them to abandon us. Let's keep them hidden. So not only that, not only did you have the army depleted and now down to a mere 6,000 men, the country was broke. Washington had no money to pay the soldiers. The army payroll alone for January and February of 1781 amounted to $1.6 million, and the U.S. Treasury had in it at that moment less than $500,000. And that money was increasingly in almost worthless paper continentals. The annual salary of a continental captain in 1781 was barely enough to buy a pair of shoes. I'll repeat that, the annual salary, if he got paid, and they usually didn't, was not enough to buy more than a pair of shoes. Here's what General Washington said in January of 1781 about the financial situation. Quote, there is not a single farthing in the military chest. He referred to it as an awful crisis. Now, things are about to get a lot worse. On January 1, first day of that fateful year, just a reminder, the same year that we essentially secured our independence, on January 1, the Pennsylvania line, 1,500 of the best soldiers in the Continental Army mutinies. They complain, most of them saying, look, our enlistments are up and we're not being allowed to go home. We're not being fed properly. We're not being paid. We're not being clothed. Our families are suffering. None of the promises that are being made to us are being kept, and we've had it. They killed 2 of their officers and they set out on a march to Philadelphia, intending to get what they say is due to them, the point of a bayonet. It's essentially the beginning of a coup attempt. Now, the Pennsylvania governor intervenes, Washington intervenes, there's a negotiated resolution, the men are convinced to stand down, but about 1,300 of the 1,500 men go home. They're done. But the crisis was averted for 2 weeks, because 2 weeks later, the New Jersey line mutinies, about 500 of the New Jersey line mutiny, same complaints, same MO. They kill the officers who won't join them, and they start marching on Philadelphia. And they say, we're going to get what's due us if we have to take it at gunpoint. Now, at this point, Washington is looking at his army coming unglued. He cannot afford another negotiated resolution here. He has to put his boot down firmly. So Washington, with the assistance of Mad Anthony Wayne, surrounds, captures the mutineers, and then he after a court-martial, a summary court-martial, orders the leaders of the mutiny to be executed by their own men. The mutineers are forced to shoot at point-blank range their leaders with the rest of the army watching. It was a brutal but arguably necessary act and one that we don't usually read about in the history books. But folks, does that sound like an army that by the end of the year is going to defeat the entire British army under Cornwallis? Or does that sound like an army that's coming, that's dissolving? Well, that was the situation in the North in January of that fateful year of 1781. The men are hungry, the men are poorly clothed, the men are scattered around in these posts, and they're starting to mutiny. By the way, we had French allies at that point. The French army the previous year had landed in Newport, Rhode Island, set up camp, and from that moment afterwards had done nothing, much to the disgust of George Washington. Other than cut down most of the trees in Rhode Island, they had remained inactive. This was a world war by this time. There was fighting going on in the Mediterranean. There's fighting going on in the Caribbean, in India, at Gibraltar. The French had a lot bigger fish to fry than trying to help these rebellious colonies win their independence. They were mostly focused on saving those super valuable colonies in the Caribbean, rice plantations, on sugar plantations, and so forth. So the French weren't in any great hurry to bring this thing to come in any great force to help. Now, that's a situation in the North. It's pretty bad. Now, let me describe for you the situation in the Southern Theater. If you can believe it, the situation in the Southern Theater was even worse than the situation in the North. Sometime in late 1779, the British had adopted a different strategy. They said, look, we can never get Washington to come out and fight some final climactic battle. He's always avoiding a maneuver. There hadn't been a significant battle in the North in years. They said, we're going to have a new strategy. The new strategy is going to focus on winning this war by conquering the Southern colonies. You know, after all, the British said, we got greater loyalist support in the South, which was generally true. And they also started to think, well, what if this world war ends up in a negotiated settlement? One of the typical ways to settle big wars is through something called a status quo ante. Everybody just keep what you got. Well, if that happened, if the French and the British negotiated a resolution status quo ante, the British wanted to make sure that they had a settlement, because that's where the money was. That's where the rice and the indigo and the tobacco plantations were. They wanted to make sure if this war ended with some of the colonies getting the independence, that they still had the Southern colonies. So in late December of 1779, the British attack and capture Savannah, Georgia. This is beginning what they called their Southern strategy, or their Southern campaign. 5 months later, May 1780, they invest and besiege Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina. They trap inside the city the American army, the American Southern Army, commanded by General Benjamin Lincoln, and they ultimately force the surrender of the entire American Southern Army. 6,000 men, the worst defeat of the Americans in the entire Revolution. The American Southern Army is gone. The North Carolina Continental Line, gone. South Carolina Continental Line, gone. Virginia Continental Line, almost entirely gone. There were some Virginia Continentals who were not inside Charleston when it surrendered. They were on their way to Charleston. And they got word that the city had surrendered. They turned around and started heading back to Virginia. Well, the British commander, he was a notorious, hated commander, but a very bold cavalry officer. He took his men and went out in pursuit of Buford's Continentals, Virginia Continentals, that were trying to make their way back to Virginia. He ran them down at a place called Waxhaws in northern South Carolina. When the Americans lined up, the Patriot Army lined up to resist him, he just ordered us charge right straight up the middle, broke the American line, defeated Buford, and then proceeded to slaughter many of the Patriots who had surrendered. That came to be called Tarleton's Quarter and added to his notoriety in the South. But at that point, the Virginia Continental Line also completely gone. Now, Congress then hurriedly reassembles some kind of army to give some defense in the South. They appoint as its commander Horatio Gates, who was at that time regarded as the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, a title that he did not deserve, but nevertheless, many in America at that point considered him to be a greater general than Washington. He was put in command of the Southern Army. He was given Continental troops from Maryland and Delaware to replace all those that had been lost. And he ordered up, and Congress ordered up all the militia they could get from Virginia and North Carolina to rendezvous with Gates and march south and try to block the British Army that was heading north into North Carolina. Gates a series of mistakes in how he handled his men, marched them right into a disaster at Camden in northern South Carolina. And that army, Gates's army, was thoroughly crushed. Gates himself disgracefully fled, abandoned his army in the field. One of the most important episodes in that battle, and very important for the rest of the story, was Gates lined his men up. He put his Continental soldiers on the right side of the line. His line, he put his militia, Virginia militia, commanded by General Edward Stevens, on the left, where they would face the best British soldiers. Those militiamen under Stevens, when the British attack began, threw down their weapons and ran away without firing a shot, abandoning the Continentals, who were enveloped and many of them slaughtered. That, by the way, I want to add right now, because it's important to the rest of the story, those Virginians who ran away that day were not running away because they were cowards. They were very poorly commanded, poorly deployed. They weren't armed properly to defend a British bayonet charge. All right, it was a bad leadership decision, but it got a second American army now completely wiped out. Cornwallis then began securing posts throughout South Carolina, preparing for the invasion of North Carolina and Virginia. Now, at that point, Congress finally does something right. They asked General Washington, who should we appoint to command the Southern Army? Who should we replace Gates with? And Washington, as we all know, chose his quartermaster, Nathaniel Greene, one of the greatest of many great decisions that Washington made as a commander-in-chief. But General Greene goes south to find what's left of his army. And he gets to Charlotte, North Carolina, where his army was assembling. And I just want to read to you what he describes finding when he gets there. Now, we often hear language saying, for example, that the patriots in the war, they were naked, they were starving, and we might regard that, I used to myself, as hyperbole, as exaggeration, as metaphor. The reality is they were starving, and they were, in fact, almost literally naked. Greene wrote this, wrote Thomas Sumter after he got to his army in Charlotte in December of 1780. It is a great misfortune that the little force we have is in such a wretched state for want of clothing. More than half our number are in a manner naked, so much that we cannot put on them the least kind of duty. There is a great number that have not a rag of clothes on them, except for a little piece of blanket, which they wear in Indian form around their waists. They had loincloths. That was what they were wearing. In January of 1781, Colonel William Davies wrote Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson, saying he could not send reinforcements to Greene because, and I quote, "Many men have a remnant of clothing larger than a good napkin to cover their nakedness. Some of them are so naked that they have refused furloughs to go home to get new clothes, being ashamed to travel in the situation they're in, as well as the fact that it was winter." Greene reported that only 800 of his 2,300-man army was adequately clothed and equipped, and only 1,500 were physically fit for duty. And the Continentals in Greene's army had not received a penny of pay in 2 years. Now, fortunately for the Patriot cause, there was a great victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1781. A patriot militia force called the Over the Mountain Men defeat a Tory militia force led by a British regular. It's a great victory. It bought some time, but Cornwallis is still in command. He still is in command of the situation. Greene's got very little to resist him with. So that's the situation in the South as 1781 dawns. As I said, worse, arguably, than the situation in the North. All right. What about in Virginia? Now, Virginia, as we all know, had provided much of the philosophical and political leadership of the Revolutionary War, military leadership too, of course, George Washington as a Virginian. But Virginia had been spared the battles of the Revolution. There had not been any significant battles in Virginia. Battles had been fought. Well, that was January 1, 1781, that same amazing day where all these things happened. On January 1, 1781, completely taking Virginia by surprise, the hated traitor Benedict Arnold lands an army on the James River and begins marching towards Richmond, pillaging, plundering as he goes. He's got the Queen's Rangers, the hated loyalist outfit commanded by John Graves Simcoe with him, and there is virtually nothing to stop him. In fact, when the reports first started arriving, they were so incredible that Governor Jefferson couldn't believe it. It wasn't until they were later confirmed that he could even believe it's true. Benedict Arnold's got an army in Virginia who's marching on Richmond. Yeah. And the attempts to raise any militia to oppose him were futile. There was hardly any militia available. There were no weapons to give them. Arnold marches into Richmond. The government flees. He marches into Richmond. He carries away everything he can carry. And then he begins setting up a secure post on the James. Virginia at that point is paralyzed. You got Cornwallis moving up from the south. You got Arnold with an army now to the east. Where do we send the few supplies we have, the men we have, the weapons we have? Which is the greater threat? That's going to continue to be a problem. But as you can see, the situation in Virginia is just as bad as it is in the north and in the south. In fact, it's worse because at least there is some semblance of an army to oppose the invader. In Virginia, the enemy is marching around essentially unopposed at that point. So you got the Southern Army on the verge of being overwhelmed. You got the Northern Army dissolving. You got Virginia essentially undefended at that point. Hard to imagine it being worse. But there were other things going on to add to this disastrous situation beginning of this year. The war on the frontier, we haven't mentioned that, but you know, throughout the course of the American Revolution, there was a war going on that isn't talked about very much, and that's the war between the settlers on the frontier and the Indians who were allied with the British. The Iroquois, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, had all allied with the British, and the British were encouraging them to attack the settlers to keep militia pinned down. So the militia on the frontier could not come and help fight the British. Hundreds of settler families were massacred during the years of this war. And whenever the militia were able to and could respond to these Indian attacks, they responded in kind. It was a brutal war that was going on there. And as it says in the Declaration of Independence, the Indians did not fight the war the way Europeans did. They made no special regard for children or women or whatnot. I mean, it was a difficult, horrible situation if you were on the frontier, which wasn't very far away. All right, you had that situation. Then you had the home front. The American economy at the beginning of 1781 has never been worse. It had never been worse then. It's never been worse since. It was the worst economic situation we had ever faced. See, in 1775, the money that America needed to fight the war, there's very little money circulating in America at the time. Money in those days, meaning gold, silver, they called specie or hard money. That money was already gone. It had been spent on supplies, on armaments, on pay. By 1775, the Continental Congress had decided to do what governments always do in that situation, and that is to start printing money. They started printing out notes. These were called Continentals. They were theoretically to be exchanged in the future for gold and silver. They printed about $1 million worth of these eventually. And good patriot people accepted them and circulated them. But by 1780, Congress had issued $200 million in paper money without ever having redeemed $1 of it. The American economy was in a shambles. In 1781, what you could have purchased in 1775 for 74 cents now cost $100. And it was getting worse literally every day. George Washington said, it takes a wagon load of money to buy one wagon load of provisions. And this is the origin of the expression as worthless as a continental. So on the home front, we have hyperinflation, prices skyrocketing. Thomas Jefferson said this money, this paper money, has no more value than oak leaves. Okay, but suppose you are a family, you're the head of a family, and the commissary department shows up and says, we're here, we want your horse, we want your cattle, we want your grain. If you have any guns, we want those. And here's what we're going to give you for them, paper money. At that point, even the most ardent patriots were beginning to say, you're giving me this money, it has no value. By the time you're out of sight, it's going to be worth less than it is now. You're starting to have unrest. Laws started compelling people to accept it as payment. Even the most ardent patriots were starting to become dispirited. There was this danger, constant danger of impressment. If you were between 18 and 50, you were subject to being drafted into the militia and sent off to fight British regulars, often without proper training or armaments. If you were a woman, your husband, your brother, your son were in that situation. All right. One last bit of bad news before we start talking about the turnaround. You know, we often think of the Revolutionary War in terms of the British fighting the Americans, the Redcoats against the Patriots. But there was a savage war going on the entire time, American versus American. About 20% of the American population was loyalist and committed loyalist and stayed committed loyalists throughout the war. They do not favor independence. Many of them took up arms and joined the British Army, or that is, joined provincial units that fought with the British Army. Many others fought guerrilla warfare or resisted in other ways. Only about 40% of the population were committed patriots, that is, committed to independence from beginning to end. That 40%, by the way, when I said earlier that you had this little thinly populated backwater series of colonies fighting this empire, well, you had 40% of the population of those colonies fighting the empire. You had a full 20 to 30, some estimates as many as a third of the colonists who were fighting for the British. And then you had about 30 to 40% who were indifferent or who were waiting to see how things worked out. But this civil war that was going on, particularly in the upcountry in the South, particularly in North Carolina upcountry and South Carolina upcountry, it was savage. It was brutal. Murders, assassinations, summary executions, arson, torture, commonplace. A lot of this is attributable, I think, just to the character of the people who were living there, who are fighters by nature, you know, the Scots-Irish and the Scotch settlers who were in that upcountry. But here's what Nathaniel Greene said when he got south. Now, he had been in the North the entire time. This was not a tea party going on up there, if you pardon the expression. There's brutal American-on-American warfare going on in the North. But when he got to the South, it was nothing like anything he'd seen before. He wrote George Washington, and here's what he said. He said, in New England, the difference between the Whig and the Tory is little more than a division of sentiment. But here, meaning the South, they persecute each other with little less than savage fury. The sufferings and the distress of the inhabitants beggars all description and requires the liveliest imagination to conceive of the cruelties and the devastation which prevail. British General O'Hara described it this way. He said, it is beyond the curb of religion and humanity. In other words, religion and just good humanity wasn't enough to stop these people from murdering each other. Captain William Pierce wrote St. George Tucker. William Pierce was one of Greene's aides. He wrote George Tucker, and said this about what was going on. Scenes of desolation, bloodshed, and deliberate murder I was never a witness to before. Wherever you turn, the weeping widow and the fatherless child pour out their melancholy tales to wound the feelings of humanity. The two opposite principles of Whiggism and Toryism have set the people of this country to cutting each other's throats. And scarce a day passes, but some deluded poor Tory is put to death at his door. For the want of civil government, the bands of society are totally disunited, and the people, by copying the manners of the British, have become perfectly savage. Now, that's a situation. Any objective observer of this situation as 1781 dawned would have to conclude that there is little hope for the American cause. Stalemated in the North, two armies wiped out already in the South, and a third on the apparently about to be next. An economy on the brink of total collapse, if not already collapsed. A civilian population at each other's throats, literally. And yet, by October, we've essentially won this war. It is the greatest turnaround in American history. So what happened? How did that happen? Well, this is a story, when Jared began this by saying I was going to say this is a story that needs to be understood better. I don't think people understand this well enough, because I could fast forward to Yorktown. What a brilliant campaign. George Washington gets the British to slip, convinces them he's about to attack New York, joins up with the French, steals a march, gets to Yorktown. The French Navy decides to take a chance, slips out of the Caribbean and wait out hurricane season, catches the British there, defeats them, which is remarkable. French Navy defeating the British Navy. And all those seemingly miraculous events happen. But folks, none of that's going to happen. We never get it, except for what happened in the first 3 months of 1781, this particularly dark period in American history. Little light's going to start to shine. And that turnaround begins at a little place, place in the middle of nowhere in upcountry South Carolina called the Cowpens. Now, I'd love to tell you more details about that story. Battle of Cowpens is one of the greatest stories in American history, certainly in American military history, and what happened there needs to be better known. I do tell that story, the Battle of Cowpens, through the eyes of participants in my book, if you'll pardon the pun. I mean, pardon the plug, but I'm going to have to skip over that a little bit now. Suffice it to say that General Daniel Morgan, well, go back up a little bit. Nathaniel Greene was the son of a Quaker merchant from Rhode Island. He had zero military training to speak of. That's true of a lot of our greatest leaders. So Greene wasn't hemmed in by what the textbook said. And one of the things that he did when he took command is he took his army and broke it into two. So, we all know you don't divide your army in the face of a superior enemy, but that's what he did. And he sent Daniel Morgan off to the west with some of his best troops to kind of support the patriots out there who were getting kicked around pretty bad by the Tories, and to kind of distract Cornwallis, and also because he didn't have enough provisions to keep his army all in one place. Well, Morgan's out there in the west, and Cornwallis has resolved, and Tarleton resolved, we're going to make him pay for that mistake, and we're going to defeat, we're going to crush that detachment. But what Morgan does, the historian John Buchanan says of this, he says, this untutored son of the frontier, talking about Daniel Morgan, who I regard as perhaps the quintessential American. He says, this untutored son of the frontier was the only general in the American Revolution of either side to produce a significant original tactical thought. What was that thought? What Morgan did is Morgan understood militia and how to use them. You don't put them on the front line to face British regulars the way Gates did, not that way. So Morgan devised a plan, which we now would call defense in depth, but he put his men in three parallel lines. The first line being a rifleman from Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. And he told those men, I do not expect you to fight it out with the British hand-to-hand. In fact, I command you not to. You're to fire 2-3 well-aimed shots, target the officers, do as much damage as you can, fall back behind the second line. The second line was the rest of his militia, Carolina men, and they had muskets. But once again, they were told, you're just to deliver 2 or 3 good shots, do as much damage as you can, fall back behind the third line. The third line, we're going to make our stand. That's where the Continentals were. That's where the Virginia troops were, most of whom were discharged former Continentals. Anyway, to speed things up, it worked brilliantly. Morgan understood Tarleton's strategy. He understood the way Tarleton thought. Tarleton got there early in the morning, marched his men like crazy. He didn't reconnoiter the scene. He didn't soften them up with artillery. He said, no, charge right up the middle, crush them. They'll run. We'll capture them. We'll destroy them. And that's what he did. He went right up the middle, and he himself was crushed. He lost 90% of his men. It was probably the only double envelopment of the war. Take 90% of Tarleton's force, either kills, wounds, or captures them. And then begins what we call the race to the Dan, which historian Lawrence Babbage, I heard him recently talk at the Battle of Cowpens reenactment. He says it's the longest sustained battle of the American Revolution, because it goes from Cowpens all the way to Guilford Courthouse. It goes from January of 1781 all the way to March 15th. Morgan's marching north with his prisoners. Cornwallis is incensed. He's infuriated. He is absolutely determined to run Morgan down and get those men back. These are some of the best soldiers in the British Army, by the way, that he's captured. Scottish Highlanders, for example. Cornwallis sets out in mad pursuit of Morgan. Morgan has to cross. We think of this dramatic crossing of the Dan, this perilous last-minute escape across the Dan, and it was, but that was one of three. He also had to cross the Yadkin River and the Catawba River. There were no bridges in North Carolina at the time. It's the middle of winter. It's raining, but he manages to get across those rivers in all three cases in the nick of time, saving the army. Greene unites his army. That is, Greene's main force unites with Morgan's force at Guilford Courthouse on February the 9th. Guilford Courthouse, which is now Greensboro. Now, Morgan is completely incapacitated with some form of arthritis or bursitis or something at that point, and he has to retire. But Greene has to make a decision February 9th. He calls a council of war with his lead officers and said, gentlemen, what are we going to do? Do we stay here and fight it out? Do we take a stand now? Or do we make a run for the Dan River? Do we try to get across the river, reprovision, reinforce, and resupply these men? And the officers were unanimous. If they tried to fight the British at that point, they would be defeated. And the war would be over because there would be no way to come up with yet a fourth Southern Army. So Greene makes the decision to dash for the river. Now, this was brilliant what he did. And I'm just giving it to you in summary form. But again, it's laid out in more detail in Buchanan's book and in novel form in my own. But Greene tells Otho Holland Williams, Lieutenant Colonel Otho Holland Williams, I'm creating a light infantry force and some cavalry, and that's you. And you're going to make a dash for these fords on the upper Dan, that is to the west of where, say, Danville is today. Those were the only fords that were the only way to ford the river at this time of year was there. And Cornwallis knew that. He had Tory spies in Virginia who were feeding him that information. He said, you're to dash for those fords. You're to lead Cornwallis in that direction. You're to make him think you're the entire American army. And you're essentially going to be the fox. You're going to lead him away, right? And then I'm going to take the main army and I'm going to run as hard as I can for these ferries down around modern South Boston, Boyd's Ferry and Irvine's Ferry. Well, I just said the river wasn't fordable that time of year. Why would you do that? Cornwallis said, well, there's no way they're going to do that because you can't get across the river there. And I know from my spies there are no boats there. What he was always thinking ahead. Months earlier, had ordered his commissary department, his quartermaster, find every boat you can on the Dan River, secure them in that area, and hide them so the spies can't see them. So there were, in fact, boats at those ferries. Greene gets his army there. These men are marching 20 hours a day. And so are the British, by the way. Both sides, back point, are barefoot, marching through this sparsely populated wilderness, really, in the middle of winter. But anyway, Greene escapes across the river. As soon as Williams learns that Greene's made it, then he turns and dashes for the river itself. And really, in an amazing story, the entire American army makes it across the river and is saved and is rescued. And that's usually where we stop telling the story of the Race of the Dan. Race of the Dan, Greene wins the Race of the Dan. The American army is saved. The citizens all come out and give heroes welcome. All true. But that doesn't turn things around. What have I just described? Yeah, the army doesn't get defeated, but North Carolina is now conquered. North Carolina now belongs to the British. Well, Greene, of course, realizing his desperate situation his army was in, he safely behind the Dan River establishes winter quarters and rides out the winter, resting, reprovisioning his men, drilling them. No, it's not what he did at all. In fact, what he did instead was incredibly audacious. About a week later, a week after he had saved his neck by getting his army across the river, he takes them back across. This time, he takes them across the river and he marches toward Cornwallis. And Cornwallis found it, could hardly believe it. He had withdrawn all the way back to Hillsborough to gather up as many of the loyalists in the state as he could. And but Greene had said, look, I can't let the Patriots in North Carolina think we've abandoned them. He's still waiting for the for the Virginia militia to get armed. But he goes ahead, he goes back into North Carolina, and he starts playing this cat and mouse game with Cornwallis. And so for the next month, he's moving his camp every single day. Cornwallis doesn't know, is he about to attack? Is he about to retreat? And they're dancing around. Meanwhile, Greene is desperately waiting for reinforcements for the militia to show up. Meanwhile, remember what I said, you got Arnold in Virginia. You've got a British army there. You've got very limited supplies. There aren't enough guns to arm the militiamen in Virginia. The governor has to make a decision. Who do I send these weapons to? Well, eventually enough weapons get to, it's a long story. I'm going to condense it. Enough weapons get to the militia that they're able to arm themselves. Enough Virginia militia can go to North Carolina, can join Greene, and Greene at that point resolves to attack Cornwallis. But then he gets some remarkable news. On the 14th of March, he gets a report from his scouts. It says, Cornwallis is marching. He's marching toward us. Cornwallis is going to attack us. Well, Greene at that point says, well, if he's going to attack me, then I'll take Dan Morgan's advice and I'll fight a defensive battle. Now, Cornwallis had so little regard for the American army. Cornwallis was outnumbered 3-1. He thought he was outnumbered 6-1, but decides the right thing to do here is to attack. But this gives Greene the opportunity to fight a defensive battle. He attacks Morgan's strategy, 3 parallel lines. There were some significant differences in the layouts that caused this tactic to be not as effective at Guilford Courthouse. There was a much greater distance between the troops. But let me just summarize it for you. The first line is 1,000 North Carolina militiamen behind a rail fence, prone, laying down on the ground with their guns resting on the bottom rail. In front of them is a large 250-yard plowed field. The British have got to march across that field to get to that line of militiamen who are, as I said, able to lay behind that fence and aim their guns. Nathaniel Greene looked at that and said, this is the most advantageous defensive position I have ever seen. The second line, Greene puts his Virginia militia in the woods about 300 yards behind the North Carolina. And then the third line, again, following Morgan's advice, are his Delaware and Maryland Continentals and the Virginia regulars, former regulars, state troops that are in that third line. Well, when I said earlier the race of the Dan, you can think of it as kind of like a pendulum swinging from Cowpens. The pendulum swings all the way to the Dan River, and Greene makes it across this nip and tuck last-minute escape across the Dan River. But that pendulum then swings back, and this time it's like a wrecking ball, and the wrecking ball collides at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. The British launched their attack. What happened on that first line that day continues to be controversial to this day. Greene and Light Horse Harry Lee both later reported that the North Carolinians ran away without firing a shot. We know now that's not true. They did fire, in many cases fired more than one shot, did damage the British Army. But the North Carolina militia did not follow their orders after they fired. Instead of rallying behind the second line, almost all of them went all the way home. They left. But when the British hit the second line, the second American line of Virginia militia, remember the Virginia militia who fought at Camden, threw down their weapons and ran without firing a shot? They're there. They're on the left side. They're on the south side of the New Garden Road. And on the north side of the New Garden Road is General Lawson's Virginia Militia Brigade. When the British hit that second line, Lawson's men collapse and run. Now, again, it wasn't cowardice. There was a tactical mistake made. British moved his men around, himself flanked, and they're gone. General Lawson's brigade, casualties in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, one dead. If Stevens's men on the south side of that road perform the same way the North Carolinians and Lawson's men did, this battle's over. This war may be over. The British are going to roll right up through the Virginia line like it's not even there. They're going to gobble up those Continentals on the third line. And there's no way we're going to be able to put a fourth Southern American army in the field. Cornwallis simply secures North Carolina, marches into Virginia, and either takes Washington's army from the rear or secures those southern colonies and holds them forever. So what happened that day, at that moment, on that side of the New Garden Road, from those militiamen, those same militiamen, those untrained guys serving 90-day terms with muskets, could have determined the outcome of the Revolutionary War. They did not obey their orders. They did not fire once or twice or three times and fall back. They held their line and fired until they had no ammunition left. They fired until General Stevens himself was shot down off of his horse and had to be carried from the field. They turned back 3 British attacks. They did so much damage to the British before falling back that by the time the British hit the third line, the day could still be saved. Now, a lot of valor still to be had on that third line. The British seemed on the verge of being repulsed. A dramatic cavalry charge by William Washington's dragoons. Cornwallis reacts to that, fires his artillery into a melee, taking down both some of his men and the Americans, the rebels, to stop that attack. It's swinging back and forth to go either way. Nathaniel Greene at that moment has a very important decision to make. As he sees what's happening, he's got two choices. I launch a counterattack or I withdraw. If Greene launches a counterattack at that moment, he may well have destroyed the British army and they wouldn't have to have Yorktown. The final battle of the war would have been there at Guilford Courthouse. But if that counterattack failed, he could lose his whole army. And now you lose the war. Greene made a decision on the spot that he could not risk losing this army. He had to keep this army in the field. You know, as Greene would later say about his Greene, all of Greene's victories were really, when you think about it, he would lose the battles on the field, but win them strategically. He said, we fight, we lose, we get up, and we fight again. And that's what he did. He chose to withdraw. He withdrew his men, but he kept the army intact. And Cornwallis, at the end of the day, had command of the field, but he had lost 25% of his army. And in no place that he could replace them or feed them for that matter, or clothe them. So he had no choice. He starts limping to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he can reprovision. He can bring his ships to resupply his men. And the story continues to be amazing. General Greene, Cornwallis makes the fateful decision to march north from Wilmington to link up with the British Army in Virginia. Greene trying to lure him south. I know many of you are Civil War buffs. I often think this is similar to what happened with Hood and Sherman after Atlanta. You know, Hood takes off for Tennessee, Sherman takes off for Savannah. They're marching in opposite directions. Well, that's kind of what happened here. Greene moves south, figuring Cornwallis will follow him, but he doesn't. But by the end of 1781, Greene has liberated North Carolina. He's liberated almost all of South Carolina. He's ready to take Georgia. We've turned this whole war around. Those states that had been conquered are now liberated. The British Army in Virginia that had been marching around essentially unopposed was now trapped and defeated and forced to surrender at the Battle of Yorktown. It is a remarkable story. There's so much more that I could say about it, but these last-minute arrivals of militiamen and last-minute arrivals of weapons, the events that happened at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, but you know, and how some of these same men who had turned and ran at Camden had then become heroes at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and how by now what had been a situation that in January had looked so bleak that it was hard to imagine how it could possibly turn out in anything other than a British victory, now is an American victory. And now our independence is going to be secured. Now, I hope that this story, first of all, I'm going to ask your pardon because I don't tell it as well as I should. I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think maybe an hour from now, oh, I meant to say this and I meant to say that. There's a lot more to the story. I'm just giving you it in broad strokes. But you know, I love this great line from Shakespeare's play Henry V, just before the Battle of Agincourt, when the king says, "This story shall the good man teach his son." You know, in modern language, we might say, "This story shall good people teach their children." This story of how American resilience and determination, and frankly, a lot of good luck, or as Washington would say, providential blessing, allowed this cause that seemed lost to turn into one that had been won. I'd like to close by reading this, by reading something. In 1884, I think it was, no, 1892, some dedicated residents of North Carolina got together and acted to preserve the Guilford National Battlefield, which is now Guilford National Battlefield Park. It would have been lost had they not acted. And so that battlefield park was dedicated in 1892, and a poet in Greensboro named Ellen Dowdell Hunley wrote a poem called Guilford Battleground that she read at the dedication. And I think it's fit as we remember this story. And it's the poem from which I got the title of the novel. So I'll just read you these lines. Shall they be unremembered, those heroes of old, their graves all forgotten, their story untold? Shall time in his flight bear their prestige away, and the deeds they have done be the thought of a day? Ah, no. From this spot, let a pillar arise, and let the gray of the stone pierce the blue of the skies. Let the evergreens spring where their ashes repose, and plant over them sleeping the lily and the rose. All right, thanks again. Thanks to Jared for the invitation. I really wish we were a live audience here because I'd love to field some questions, but I don't know how to do on time, Jared.
You're great. You're doing great. I
Right.
do have two questions for you though for our people watching. The first is if they want to go visit either Guilford Courthouse or the race to the dam, what's there now for them to see?
All right, great question. We got two national battlefield parks, one at Cowpens and one at Guilford. They are don't miss spots if you're interested in American history. Both are great. Both are great places to walk around. You can get a good feel, good visitor centers, good feel of the history there. Some of the other really important spots of this story have been lost, frankly. The Battle of Cowan's Ford, which I didn't have time to talk about, a very crucial episode in the Race to the Dan, is now under Lake Norman. Cowan's Ford is now under Lake Norman, for example. The Battle of Weitzel's Mill, North Carolina's got a marker for it, sitting out on the side of US 29, long ways from where the action took place and impossible to stop and read the sign anyway. But you know, you got to do some work, but those sites, I do encourage people to make plans to attend the Crossing of the Dan events that are held every year at the anniversary of the Crossing of the Dan on February 14th weekend, which is put on in the town of South Boston. The great events, and you can go and actually visit the site where Green's Army crossed the Dan, both to escape and then return back across the Dan to take it to the British. So those are really great sites to see. Now, if you're hardcore like I am, you can dig deeper. There is a website, American Revolution in North Carolina or something like that, where you can go to that'll actually give you detailed coordinates for more obscure episodes from the war. I can help you, Jared, with that site if you want to put it in your show notes or something. And that'll enable you to track it down. But yeah, good question. Great things to see. I know there's talk underway about creating a trail that will be better marked, that would trail that you could drive that would follow a lot of these things as well. Maybe that'll be out in time for the 250th anniversary.
Yeah, I hope so. And the second question is, could you talk more about your book or your novel and how it kind of correlates to the story?
Well, yeah, I'd be pleased to. So, you know, I set out planning to write a history book. I'm a historian, really. That's my main thing. And I found that there's really so much of the story had already been told and told well in John Buchanan's book, Road to Guilford Courthouse. And I didn't know that I had enough material to create a history book the way I wanted to write it. But I started thinking that maybe another way to tell this story is to tell it in the form of a historical novel. And that's what this is. It's very carefully researched. The history is accurate. And a few cases where I made some minor deviations, they are disclosed in the author's note at the end. But what I've tried to do is tell the story of those 3 months through the eyes of both the figures we all know, the historical figures are here, Daniel Green and Cornwallis and Tarleton and William Washington and Daniel Morgan, they're all in the story, but also fictional characters who are based on actual soldiers, both Continental Dragoons, militiamen. I tell some of the story through the eyes of Tory spies, Tory militiamen, Quakers, slaves. I try to bring a lot of perspectives into it. I tell from the point of view of those fighting the battles, what it was like to fight the battles. Now, how well I've done that really is up to readers. So far, the people who have commented on the seem to have enjoyed it. Those who didn't were kind enough to keep that to themselves. But anyway, that's what I've tried to do, and I hope if that sounds like it's appealing to you, then people might give it a shot, see what you think. But I really felt that it was a way to tell the story that might be engaging to people who might not otherwise want to read a history book or really dig down into those weeds the way I can do it. You can tell it through the eyes of fictional characters and invent some storylines to carry it along. That's what I tried to do. And I know, Jared, that you've read the book and you told me you liked it, so that meant a lot to me, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say I've never been a huge fan of like historical fiction. I mean, I think the stories themselves are great, but then I read your book, and that's Let a Pillar Arise. So we'll have the link for that, so you can purchase it below. But I read that, and I learned more about not just the story of the Race to the Dam, which was a story I'd heard, for years, but all about those little small communities and little pockets of people and what they may have been up to, who lived around there. Because you tell the story of several different people from several different mindsets too, from the Whig mindset, for the Loyalists, from the Tories. And you do a great job of just meshing it all together, and it was truly fascinating. I couldn't put it down. And it's a rather thick book, but I mean, I read it in just a couple of days. I mean, it was a page turner. So, like I said, that's my endorsement. And like I said, I was not a real fan of historical fiction or novels, but I couldn't put that one down.
Yeah. Well, I'm I'm going to tell you, I'm not a fan of them either, even though I've now written 3 of them. And I was persuaded to read historical fiction by my wife, who loves it. But oftentimes what happens in historical fiction is it's more fiction than it is history.
Right.
And I've tried to make mine, balanced. I don't take liberties with the history in order to make the story better. And I don't, at the same time, I try to tell enough of an interesting story that it make people want to see what's going to happen next. Anyway, I don't know. Read the histories, and if you have time, read the historical fiction.
Well, Bill, thanks so much for coming on with us today. We greatly appreciate it. Make sure you all check out his Facebook pages, which I'll have in the description below as well. And make sure you go buy a copy of his book. Thanks, Bill.
Right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.